Thank you for that introduction. I didn't know I was laughing at my own jokes, so now I'm going to be super self-conscious about that. Thanks, Seth. Oh, there I did it. Damn it. All right, Bart, get yourself together. Yeah, so, you know, my mom loves telling stories. She's a big, sappy romantic. She loves a tragedy. A Russian lady, you know. I come from a family of performers. It goes back 3 generations. They were all like singers, comedians, quite famous, quite established people in the USSR. So she has a lot of stories to tell me, and I've always liked the stories. So she'd regaled me all my childhood with the adventures of my grandparents out on the road, performing all over the USSR. But one of her favorite stories to tell was that of my second adopted grandmother, Nona. And how I knew Nona is this wild-haired, like her, she had a mop of white hair that she never did anything with, unlike any Russian woman I've ever seen. It was just a mess of white hair and like no makeup and giant eyes through these thick glasses. She's a scholar in her very essence and an art historian by profession. She was best friends with both of my grandparents since they were all in their 20s, and she raised my mom and her sister like her own, and then myself and my brother as her grandchildren. And my mom loved telling me the story of how all of her hair went white throughout 1 year when she was 28. And it started with her mother, who was the head librarian of the municipal library in Saratov, where I'm from. She was the last remnant of some minor family of aristocracy that were all butchered in the revolution, long before Nona was born. Well, not very long, but a little bit before. During that year, she was already quite old, but she started hearing rumors that some party officials were looking for dirt on her to try to basically to get her deported to Siberia. And she knew how that shit worked. She'd seen that firsthand. So that spring, when the Volga River was thawing, she put a bunch of rocks in her coat and she walked into the icy waters. My mother promised me she died immediately of a heart attack, knowing I was very scared of drowning. Trust my mom to romanticize suicide as well. After this, Nona only had one person left, her fiancé, Ilya. A few months after this tragedy, they'd set up to meet for dinner at the museum where she was working, and she was standing on the steps waiting for him. She saw him coming off of the tram. He saw her, she waved, he rushed over, didn't see the car, died immediately. And by the time she was 29, her head of thick black hair had turned completely white, and she never took another lover, and she never married, and she never had children. And she stayed as part of my family instead. Moved to Moscow at some point. We used to go visit her there in her tiny little one-room apartment. Outside was a giant park, green, and her whole apartment was also green, filled with plants. That she was like, these were her babies. She loved her plants and books, just like books, floor to ceiling, and paintings in some of the wall bits that weren't covered in books, and a giant writing desk. The surface of which I'd never seen because it was always covered in papers and books and manuscripts. She spent her whole life writing about just one painter. She literally wrote all the books about this one painter. Very famous. And I, growing up, I admired Nona. My mom told me this romantic tale of how she lost her loved one, and my mom thought that this was the example of the ultimate love. This is true love. This suffering forever. That's true love. What I saw was a woman unlike any other I'd seen. I saw a woman who lived on her own, didn't marry, didn't have children, and to me seemed like she was living the Soviet old lady version of her best fucking life. You know, she had disciples, little, like old, also old. Her disciples were also like in their 60s. Everyone is old in this story. I mean, she was admired for what she did. She had a connection for medieval Russian iconography. Oddly, for me, she was religious. She used to take us to museums where she knew everyone. She walks in like she's guest list at the museum. And she would take us through every painting. She knows everything about it. She would regale us with these 200-year-old gossip about painters. You won't believe what he said about him when he was in France that summer. She used to just tire us out. In her 80s, in her 90s, she would tire us out in these museums, and then she would take us to these wedding cake-looking cathedrals in Moscow that to us seemed, as Israeli children, seemed very exotic and shiny. And she would just go there to pray. And she, for the first time in my life, I would see her looking like other old Russian ladies, with a little shawl on her head and a little candle, and she would get down on her little old lady knees on the cold floor, and she would pray there for a while. And I was an asshole in my occupation, mostly as a teenager. Still am, still dabble in it sometimes. And I used to just, being an asshole, I used to condescendingly humor her religiousness. And she, being an adult, used to condescendingly humor my atheism. And it was weird for me that she was religious. Nobody in my family was ever religious, and she was. And it didn't fit for me in my image of who she was. I still looked up to her because she gave me hope that I, as someone who was never at peace with the image my mother gave me of women being yearning for just one thing, being with a man and having children, that never seemed to be something I was into. And Nona gave me hope that there's a way for me to maybe live my best life someday. Now, when I was 25, my biological grandmother, my mom's mom, died after a year of slowly losing her mind. The 3 last years of her life, she was mostly talking about how much she wanted to die. And we were mostly brushing it off as being guilt-trippy, attention-seeking behavior. And after she died, I was starting to realize what it is to be an empathetic human being, and realized that we were objectifying this human being who was wasting away on our living room couch, that I never managed to see her as a full-on human with feelings, that I never had in me the room to validate what she was going through, to make room for that. And I promised myself during my agonizing grief for this, that was mostly regret. For her, I was happy. She wanted to go. But I vowed to myself that I'm not going to let this happen with any of my elders. And when my mom said that she wants to surprise Nona for her 90th birthday and come to Moscow and surprise her, I was like, yeah, we're going. This is going to be awesome. I want to meet Nona as a human being and not just a story and not just a grandma. And we came over, and she was so happy to see us. Her only family, really, at her 90th birthday, suddenly shows up from Israel. She was overjoyed, immediately took us to a museum, tired us out. In the evening, we had birthday cake and tea with our neighbors, and then we pulled out all the old military cot for me to sleep on, and my mom shared the couch with Nona. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever slept on a Soviet 40-year-old military cot bed, but it's not great. So I couldn't sleep, and I saw the light on in the tiny kitchen, and I walked in, and I always felt like way too big in this tiny, tiny apartment. And so she was there, and honestly, I'd never seen her like that before. She was there without her glasses, so her eyes looked regular-sized and kind of confused and sad, and her hair was wild and white, and her face was ragged and white, and her nightgown was white, and she was just this blob of wilted paleness, and she looked really just lost and small, and not cheerful, and not a cartoon of a scholar. And she poured me some tea, and she asked me, "Do you believe in God?" And I said, "No." because I was still an asshole sometimes. And she said, "That's because you haven't experienced a lot of things in your life. And I thought, you don't condescend like that over me. What do you think you went through that you can know for sure?" I asked her. And she said to me, and she thought about this for a while. And I was expecting some kind of trite nonsense about angels or dreams or whatever. But instead she said, "Did your mother ever tell you about my fiancé, Ilya?" And I was like, holy shit, what? Yes, she did tell me. I'm very sorry. That was a huge tragedy. And she said, "It was my fault." What? She said, "I never told this to anybody. But I didn't want to marry him. I didn't love him. I didn't want to have children. I didn't want to marry anybody. But there was no way to tell him this. There was no way anyone would ever accept this choice. So I just prayed every day for months as the wedding approached. I prayed every night to God to just take him away, just so that he goes away. And I wouldn't have to tell anything, and I wouldn't have to do anything, just so that he would go somewhere else." And when I got the call from my friend at the hospital that he had died in a car crash, and here I was like, wait, did my mom fabricate that dramatic scene at the museum? Yes, she did. She really did. Apparently she just heard from an acquaintance on the phone who worked at the hospital. And she said, when I got this phone call, the first thing I felt was relief. And the second was shame. I knew that God had answered my prayers. I couldn't look his mother in the eyes. I couldn't even get myself to go to his funeral. And I sat there and thought, this woman is not at all the woman that I thought she was. And she's definitely not the romantic, tragic heroine that my mother painted her out to be. And whatever she was, this naive, childlike outlook on guilt, the smallness of it, the youthfulness of it, to carry this guilt with her all her life. I asked her, is this the God you were praying to at the cathedrals this whole time? She said yes. And I wondered if she was praying that he never answers a single prayer of hers again. And I thought after this for a long time about a lot of the stories that my mother told me, and how maybe they were skewed for dramatic effect or for romantic effect. And it made me rethink a lot of the things she told me about how women are supposed to strive for men's attention, for having children, and maybe think about the things she said to me about how a father has to love his children, which was not a fact about my life. And it made me realize that most of the stories she was telling me, she was really just telling to herself. And I hope that maybe tonight you will think about some of the stories that your parents have told you. Thank you.